The Secret History of the Mongols stands as the singular, most important 13th century literary and historical record of the Mongol Empire. Yet the original Mongolian manuscript is entirely lost. The text survived only because Ming Dynasty scholars preserved the sound of the Mongolian spoken word by writing it out using a phonetic transcription system. In 1982, Harvard scholar Francis Woodman Cleaves attempted to reconstruct these phonetic values, producing what remains the definitive English translation. Cleaves made a highly specific stylistic choice. He rendered the 13th century Mongolian text using the exact vocabulary and cadence of the 1611 King James Bible. To understand the history of the Mongol Empire, we must look at how its primary text was encoded in Chinese script and then meticulously engineered back into archaic English. The text we read today is a composite artifact assembled across 3 distinct eras and writing systems to recover a vanished past. We start in 14th century China. Shortly after the Mongols were driven from power, Chinese scholars began transcribing the Mongolian oral tradition. They used Chinese characters purely as phonetic markers. The actual meaning of the character was discarded. It served only to replicate a specific spoken Mongolian syllable. This diagram illustrates how they structured the manuscript pages. First, you have the phonetic Chinese character representing the Mongolian sound. Beneath that, a smaller gloss character provides the definition, followed finally by a complete translation. This method prioritized preserving the exact 13th century pronunciation, even though it rendered the text nearly unreadable as Standard Chinese. The most complete version of this transcription was eventually archived in the massive 15th century encyclopedia, the Yongle Tadian. We know exactly when this 15-section manuscript entered the Imperial collection. The notation at the bottom records its receipt in September or October of 1404. This specific version became the foundation for all modern study of the text in the West. The manuscript remained largely inaccessible until the 19th century, when it was acquired in Peking by the Russian archimandrite Palladier. In 1866, Palladier published a Russian translation to make the text available to European scholars. However, Palladier's version had a significant limitation. He translated the abridged Chinese translation found in the manuscript, entirely bypassing the raw phonetic Mongolian data. It would take decades of intense linguistic analysis by scholars like Paul Pelliot to reconstruct the original Mongolian words from the Chinese phonetic markers. By the 20th century, the raw Altaid data was finally reclaimed. But scholars still lacked a way to present it in English that respected its alien syntax. This was the problem facing Francis Woodman Cleaves. He needed to translate an ancient Altaic language into English without smoothing out the foreign logic of its construction. He anchored his method in the translation theories of Alexander Fraser Tytler. Specifically, Cleaves adhered to Tytler's second law, that a translation must maintain the exact style and manner of writing found in the original text. Cleaves argued that the verse structure of the Mongolian text demanded an archaic flavor, matching the prose of the 17th century. As his linguistic model, he chose the authorized version of the 1611 Bible, adopting its vocabulary and style as his baseline. But Mongolian syntax presents a grammatical barrier. It often lacks the definite articles, pronouns, and auxiliary verbs that English requires to function. Cleaves solved this by adding the necessary English words, but he enclosed every addition in brackets to separate them from the pure Mongolian source text. He wasn't the first to mark superadded words. Translators of the Gospel of Matthew commonly used italics for this purpose. Cleaves rejected italics, choosing brackets to make the separation between the original text and his modern engineering completely unmistakable. He did make practical exceptions. To maintain readability, he left basic articles and third-person pronouns unbracketed. The text presents a technical schematic, exposing the exact mechanics of how the translation was built. Cleaves used the 1611 aesthetic as a philological tool to keep the 13th century Mongolian framework visible. The transmission of this history spans 3 distinct stages: the 13th century Mongolian oral tradition, the 15th century Chinese phonetic code, and a 20th century English reconstruction using 17th century tools. Look at this diagram as a vertical data stack. The base is the lost Mongolian original, the middle layer is the Chinese phonetic code, and the top is Cleaves' bracketed 1611 English. If you remove any layer, the historical integrity of the data collapses through the visible layers of the engineering. Cleave's translation operates exactly this way. It preserves the contours of an ancient world that would otherwise have scattered like dust.